All right, and welcome back to Afternoon Drive on Joppa Radio. My name is Drew Moholland. Hello to the folks there on the television. Another great show on tap for you here today. It's been a busy day for me, but it's beautiful out there. I like the 40 degrees and sunshine on the as we're approaching December. You can't really complain. A coworker of mine was golfing today, so that's not too bad at all. I hope everybody's doing well out there. We have a great guest today. I put on Twitter that we're going to learn something today, which is good. We had a bunch of guests last time. We had high school guests, a couple great high school athletes from Newburyport. Show before that, we had the Amesbury athletic director. So the first couple shows were sports related. But as I told you, that is not always going to be the case. The goal of this show is to just get interesting guests on whatever topic is out there and kind of whatever interests me, and I hope it kind of interests you out there. So today we're joined by Mike Morris. He's the chairman of Storm Surge. We're going to bring him in a couple minutes. You can probably guess what the group Storm Surge stands for, but I'm going to let him kind of come in and give us the real details on that and explain that for us. We have a lot to talk about with Mike Morris, so I'm excited about that, and it should be good. So we're going to take our first music break here in just a couple minutes. I was just going through our thing, and I decided it was probably a good time to maybe start getting some Christmas music in, so maybe we'll do that at some point, but throughout the show. But don't forget, folks, follow us on Twitter as well. Our account is at North Shore Live, North Shore Radio. Put some pictures up there. I know we got some good action last time we were tweeting during the show. We put some pictures up of our guests last week. We'll do the same today with Mike Morris. But at North Shore Live is the Twitter handle. We'll try to do a good job and keep you interactive that way. And also, if you're listening, if you have any, I'll keep an eye on it as we go throughout all the shows. If you have any questions for our guests, you can maybe stay interactive and use our Twitter handle and send us some questions. And you may have some today because we're going to cover some interesting ground with Mike Morris. So we'll do that when we get back in just a minute. Mike Morris, chairman of Storm Surge, are going to be our guest today on Afternoon Drive here with your host, Drew Moholland. Again, hello to everybody streaming. We'll be back in just a moment. Keep it here, Joppa Radio. All right, and welcome on back to Afternoon Drive here on Joppa Radio. My name is Drew Moholland. Again, very excited about our first guest here today, Mike Morris. He is the chairman of the group Storm Surge. And Mike, I was reading all sorts of stuff about your group here before I came in, and some fascinating reads, actually, but a lot of good articles about you guys over the past few years. And but first of all, for people who don't know, Storm Surge, why don't you tell us what it is? And thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Drew. So Storm Surge is a volunteer group based out of Newburyport, but we've got members from surrounding towns participating. And the group basically came into existence following the winter storm season that started off with Hurricane Sandy and then was followed by 4 or 5 other really fairly large coastal storms that ended with a storm in March where a number of houses fell in to the ocean on Plum Island, and a whole bunch of others were critically damaged. So we thought that the reaction of just randomly dumping stone on the beach was kind of a poor way to adapt to sea level rise and climate change issues. So the group formed as a result of that, and what we've been doing is motivating our communities basically to look at what their risks are and to start thinking about dealing with those.
So, and I mean, this is really a very interesting place to do all this research because it's such a real life issue. You talk about Plum Island. I mean, that is no joke when you talk about places literally falling into the ocean. I mean, how in danger are some of these houses right now, some of these places on Plum Island on the coastline?
Well, Plum Island isn't unique.
Yeah.
There are many barrier beaches up and down the East Coast that are basically facing the same issues. And if you're looking at it sort of from a bird's eye perspective, a barrier beach is basically a barrier between the ocean and the mainland, and it's a natural protective barrier for the mainland from big coastal storms. However, up and down the East Coast, we've chosen to build communities on those very barriers, so it's sort of like building a house on top of a seagull.
Right. You get the beautiful views.
Well, yeah, there's, you fly first class, right? First to get on, first to get off, and also first to crash. But anyway.
It was a very grim description.
Yes, unfortunately, that's the case. But, I've lived on Plum Island. and I totally understand what it's like to be there and the beauty that draws everybody there. But it doesn't come without risk. And certainly, the houses that are in the front line, that are sitting in the barrier dune, they're in a tough spot because the island has been stepping backwards, and that's what barriers do when the sea level rises. And, the house lots start to erode out from underneath where the houses are.
And, you happen to join us on a day here where it is the technical end to hurricane season, but I know I talked with you a little bit about that off the air, and you kind of laughed because there's no, there could easily be a hurricane today or tomorrow.
Sure.
I'm sure you probably have a lot of big storms memorized in your head that have happened after this day, but it really was, it seemed to be, I think it's the most costly hurricane season in the record books this past hurricane season, and really just devastating for so many places. Houston, where there's several hurricanes. When you look at the devastation that the hurricanes do, and you would think that so many of these places across the world would say, maybe I am next. You got to be careful of these things, and groups like yours are doing the best, I guess, to help prepare. Is that a good word for it? Or
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, the hurricane season certainly was a tough one. All storms basically feed off of heat energy.
Yep.
Hurricanes more specifically feed off the heat energy in the ocean. Storms like northeasters that we get more frequently up here in the Northeast, they feed also off of heat energy, but they primarily form between the clash of cold air and warm air. But all the storms are becoming more intense as time goes on. Coastal communities are at risk to rising sea levels and things getting wet. And so a lot of communities are looking at, all right, where are we going to move this out of harm's way? But what a lot of communities are currently at risk for are storm surges from big storms, be they northeasters, hurricanes, or these hybrid storms that form like Hurricane Sandy did, for example.
Yeah, and they do seem to be becoming more and more common. And maybe that is the global warming. I'm sure you've done more research than I have on this,
Sure.
but it does seem like these storms are becoming more and more powerful, and almost random too. It's more of a random nature. Maybe they've always been that way, but it does seem to be more of them.
So, whoever designed the Earth, okay. Built in this.
We'll tackle that question at a later date, right?
built this system where the equator heats up, and the poles stay cold, and so to normalize the temperature of the Earth, we have weather systems, specifically storms, transporting that heat and humidity that we have along the equator to the poles, and that's what sort of stabilizes our climate. With global warming and climate change, the greenhouse gases we've put into the atmosphere basically put a blanket over the Earth. So a lot of this radiation that would normally escape back out to space is being held in. And the oceans are the big normalizers for the temperature because 75% of the world's surface area is water. And so the oceans have been sucking in this heat over the last 100 years. And actually, that's why we've only had a few degrees average of temperature rise, because all the heat's in the ocean.
Which is misleading because people don't. What do you mean global warming?
But if you think about it in terms of like this, if you own a swimming pool and you had a swimming pool and you had it at, let's say, 65 degrees and you wanted to heat it up another 5 degrees, that's a fair amount of money, right, to keep that going. Well, what if you did that to the world's oceans? And that's basically what we've done. It's a ton of energy that's captured there, and the storms feed off of that. And that's why they're bigger. They may not necessarily be more frequent because certain variables have to align for storms to form. And in some cases, climate change may align those variables more commonly. In the case of hurricanes, it's not necessarily true, but once they do align, and with all that energy that's there in the ocean, it's like throwing lighter fluid on a barbecue. I mean, it just explodes.
Yeah, that's quite a visual. I wonder, so when you hear, you happen to have a administration right now who climate change is not priority number one, certainly compared to past administrations here. And I wonder how you're, without, I don't mind if you get too political, but you do whatever you need to do. But with that becoming from the White House not so much of a priority, how dangerous do you see that possibly being when you look at the world, as you see, you're pulling yourself out of climate deals, and what does this? Could that be a huge, giant step back for us just in this time period?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
We are the world leaders, right?
Yep.
Everybody looks up to the United States, and here we're in a leadership position on this issue, and now we're turning the clock back to 1940, 1950. I don't think we're going to be running cars on coal anymore, and the free market is really accelerating beyond what the administration is proposing. And so market forces to a large extent are going to shape what happens worldwide, because certain forms of energy, aside from the whole pollution and climate change issue, they're just not affordable anymore. I mean, coal is not competitive with natural gas, for example. What we're doing is we're shooting ourselves in the foot, because we're losing out on an economic opportunity. We shouldn't be purchasing solar panels from China. We should be manufacturing them and selling them to the world. So we're sort of giving up a big chunk of economy here by doing this, and that's one issue. And then of course the other issue too is if you look at all the data and the graphs, you kind of have to ask yourself, where's the tipping point in all this? When does this problem of global warming start to get away from us before we can actually really affect change? Because this is really kind of a slow motion disaster with a lot of momentum to it. So we start applying brakes now. I mean, the effects won't be felt for 50 or 100 years. But if we don't do anything, 50 to 100 years from now, could be some major problems.
Yeah, and let's bring it back to just this neck of the woods too. And you started off by talking about Plum Island, and when these storms happen, whether it be a nor'easter or whatever, the vulnerability of a place like Plum Island. And you said you lived there, right?
Yep.
You must have seen some. You remember some big storms out there?
Sure. I mean, certainly as a kid in high school, Storm of '78 was one of the memorable ones.
Yep.
And we'll be talking about that storm at a function we're having at City Hall on December 7th. I can talk more about that later.
Sure.
But anyway, so there were some big changes there, certainly. Plum Island wasn't as developed back then. Well, I shouldn't say as developed. It wasn't developed with the expensive homes it has now. Mm-hmm. And a bunch of cottages and so forth were lost and flooded, and basements were filled with sand from the overwash and that sort of thing. Something like that happened today, there would be a lot of devastation along the seacoast in Massachusetts, not only Plum Island or Salisbury.
Yeah, and it's funny, I work in a newsroom as well, and every time one of these storms hits the North Shore, the first instinct in the newsroom is send that reporter out to Plum Island, and you see them on the coastline with the wind. And
they used to send them down to Scituate. They never used to send them to Plum Island until like in the last 10 or 15 years. Because Plum Island's come more upscale. There's been more investment there, and it's a nice place to go, and so there's more influence. What is
the mindset if you're living there right now with all this kind of hovering around? I mean, maybe some houses are more in danger than others or whatever, but I mean, do you have a number on the top of your head? Is there a dozen houses that you look at and say, oh, geez, that does not look great? Or
well. I look at it from a scientific perspective. I look at it, for example, I drew a line from the vegetation in the Salisbury State Reservation where there is a natural dune system. Yep. And drew that down to the vegetation line in the wildlife refuge, which is also a natural dune system. There's probably, on Plum Island, 50 or 70 houses that sit on or ahead of that line. That line represents where the ocean would like to be.
That's trouble.
And the only reason those houses are there is because the jetty system is collecting enough sand to artificially create land that these houses can sit on. When that jetty system falls into disrepair, we start to get erosion on the ocean front. Houses become endangered.
That's an unbelievable visual of that's where the ocean would like to be. I've never thought about it or heard it in that way, but it's an incredible thought.
The grass retreats to where there's no salt, and that's where it will live.
Wow.
So we have houses ahead of that.
Okay. And that's interesting and scary and all of that at once. I mean, what do you do? I mean, some of those places do you just keep taking preventative measures? I'm assuming you're not going to want to be building too many more right there. I mean, there's probably no room. I haven't been out to Plum Island.
Plum Island's pretty well developed,
Yeah.
right? I mean, every lot that's out there has been built on. There are certain rules in place for building out there, and homeowners certainly have the right to build what they can within the rules.
It certainly is a beautiful spot. Everybody knows how nice.
Well, yeah, I mean it's magical. You get up there in the morning and see the sunrise and go surfing and whatever, and it's definitely a special place. That thin line between water and the mainland, right?
Yeah, and actually, our one of our guests next week is going to be the now Newburyport basketball coach. He was the former Triton basketball coach, but Coach Dave Clay played basketball at Newburyport, and now he's coaching there. I believe this is year one for him at Newburyport, and he actually lived on Plum Island, and I'm just remembering this in the back of my head. There was a story a couple of years ago where his, this has nothing to do with your line of work, but his house actually caught fire on Plum Island.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know if you remember that, but it was a really nice community come together, GoFundMe accounts and all that stuff. So it was kind of cool to see that, but certainly an active place. Never mind when you add a fire into the mix. But so let's dip into a little bit about your group. You said you hold these meetings and these clinics or whatever you want to call them. Tell us a little more about that. December 7th, was it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So our next program coming up is on December 7th at City Hall in Newburyport, and basically I think it's titled "The Next Storm." And
so when's that going to be?
It's
no, I mean the next storm.
Going to be? Yeah, that's anyone's guess. Right now, the next 10 days look okay, but I don't know about day 11.
Yeah, it was 40 and sunny out there, right, today?
So the computer models are actually pretty good. I mean, they 10 days out can't predict an exact storm, but when they start to agree that something's going to happen, it's worth looking at, But anyway, the program, we're looking at specifically risks that Newburyport is exposed to in terms of a major storm. And we're not talking like a hurricane that we saw in Puerto Rico. It doesn't even have to be that big. It's really, a northeaster with winds of like 50 to 70 miles an hour that maybe lasts for 3 days because it's a slow-moving storm. And more importantly, the approach, instead of riding off to the northeast, off to Nova Scotia, like most of these storms do, like Hurricane Sandy, the perfect storm, and even the storm of 78, these were what were known as retrograding storms. In other words, they moved from the ocean towards land, so from the southeast off to the northwest. And when a storm does that, it corrals all of this water with its wind, and it's actually sort of a bubble that's created. The sea level might be 1 or 2 feet higher out over the open ocean through the winds just pushing this water around in a circular motion. As long as that storm's over the open ocean, that water, sort of like in a toilet bowl, flushes itself out the middle of the storm down into the depths. But when it rides up over the continental shelf, you can't get rid of that water, and we have a storm surge. So when that moves ashore, it creates immense flooding and all sorts of damage, and that's what happened with Sandy.
So I get the impression here. Have you ever been a teacher, by the way? Because I mean, you kind of are in this aspect, but I'm thinking to myself, I would have loved you to be a teacher back in high school. This is far more interesting than.
Sure, I had some interesting teachers that inspired me.
Well, there you go. Well said.
As far as instruction goes, I teach high performance driving. That's about
the
only instruction I do these days.
Well, there you go. It's a nice little outlet. Very good. What is the most interesting part of your job? I mean, to visualize you down there drawing those lines, that the catastrophe line, if you will, where that ocean wants to be, as you mentioned. I know part of you is going to be always thinking about maybe the worst case scenario when you're out there doing that stuff, but it's also kind of a cool job, right? To be out there and interacting with Earth and watching these things happen.
It would be even more cool if I was getting paid, then I could call it a job. Otherwise, it's sort of a side hobby of mine.
Passion of love, right?
My wife, I started this, I became involved in this, well, it goes all the way back to when, I've been a surfer since age 11. And when I went to school, I didn't specifically study oceanography and meteorology, but I took courses in that area because I needed to do my own surf forecast when I was out at UMass. So it was worth the 2-hour drive back home that I would have waves. But anyway, my wife was a selectman for the town of Newbury back in the mid-2000s. The erosion really started to accelerate. They started to have early meetings about what's going on, what should we do. She asked me to attend because I had a background in this area. And basically I concluded, well, everybody's got a lot of theories and a lot of solutions, but nobody knows what the heck's going on. And from what I know in my business, I fix technically sophisticated cars. If you don't define the problem really well, you're not going to fix it. Yep. And so I started surveying the beach, looking at historical nautical charts and things like that, came up with some theories and said, hey, you know what? What everybody thinks is going on down here is not happening. The sand's migrating in the opposite direction. And you can do all of these things with the sand migrating south, and it's not going to have any effect. And so, long story short, that's how I became involved in it. We were living down there at the time, and so daily I could see changes on the beach that supported my theories.
Yep.
And so now I just kind of watch it. You know, it's always interesting to see what a storm will do with different, wave energy. And
Certainly
like
is. What do you say? And maybe I'll phrase it this way, actually, because I mean it's such a political issue. But what do you say to have you seen an issue more politically divisive over the long term than climate change?
Well,
those who don't believe in it just are very, very strong.
I tell people climate change isn't a religion. It's not something you can believe in. You can either accept the data and the facts and acknowledge it, or you can ignore it. And that's really the only alternative. I mean, obviously, when people choose not to believe something that's somewhat threatening, it's because of fear. It's that threat. If you have a house on Plum Island and you're one of the front row houses in a barrier dune that's on the edge, and somebody's telling you, yeah, sea level's going to rise 6 feet and there's going to be more intense storms, that's very threatening to your existence down there and your investment. And when people drop into that emotion of fear, logic oftentimes goes out the window. You tell people that solar panels and windmills, alternative energy is going to be the way to go, and you're a coal miner and you're going to be without a job. Well, you don't want to hear that. So again, it's this reaction of fear that I think clouds people's judgment and ability to analyze the facts. And of course, we have political interests that are trying to keep fossil fuels in the marketplace, because as they become more scarce, there's more money to be made from those. And so there's a lot of bad science that's floating around out there and clouding the issue among people that can't really decide for themselves. And
it jumped out at me too when we talked about Plum Island. And I joked about how they send the reporters out there now, but you did bring up Situate as well. Is it the same story? I mean, we're talking South Shore as compared to North Shore.
Right.
But are we still talking? I mean, is it pretty much the same deal in Situate, or are there subtle differences being on the South Shore?
Situate's an interesting example. We have this rubble rock seawall on parts of Plum Island, and there's no
Does that
doubt.
work?
Well, yes, it does, depending on what your objective is.
Yeah.
Okay. So, has that wall saved houses down there? Yes, it has. From the run-of-the-mill garden variety storm that we've had since 2012. We haven't had anything approaching any of those 5 storms that we had in 2012-13 since then. So it's never really been tested by a huge storm. But there are drawbacks. There are parts of the beach in front of that wall that don't exist anymore, because when waves interact with hard structures, it washes the sand off the beach, and the beach can't get a foothold to recover. Situate is a classic example of that. Situate used to have a sandy beach. Situate armored the beach, and the beach went away. So now you have a low tide beach. There's a bit of a beach at low tide, but when the tide comes in, there's no place to sit. So it's important to understand that, in my opinion, you can do whatever you want, okay? But you need to understand what the consequences are. So if you're going to build a seawall, and it's okay that you only have a beach at low tide, well, that's your decision, and if you can live with that, that's fine.
And how does that work? So the water takes the sand, smashes it, and this is probably a real simplified version of this, but picks up the sand, smashes it against the wall, and then the sand has nowhere to go. It spits it back out to sea, essentially?
Yeah, it's sort of like that. I mean, think of a snow globe, right? You shake up a snow globe, all the particles are in suspension. Well, the waves basically do that with sand. So when you get a lot of wave action, sand's just floating around like in a snow globe. But a wave, just like when you shine a flashlight into a mirror, a wave will reflect off of a hard wall. if that sand is in suspension, that reflection wave will carry that sand back out into deep water, and then you'll have rip currents transported to someplace else along the beach. And so as long as wave energy is up against the wall, sand won't ever live there for very long.
Gotcha. And then you have all the I mean, Scituate is just notorious for flooding. It's like the community and, all these storms, it somehow downtown always ends up flooded. I mean, is that a certain just building of the base? How does that work, the flooding in Scituate?
So in Scituate, what you have, when you get a northeast storm and, you've got that arm of the Cape, right, and Scituate's down in there, wind direction from the northeast is going to create a storm surge that gets captured by Cape Cod. And Scituate being there, we'll see rising water levels with that sort of wind direction. And then, of course, the wave energy comes in on top of that surge. And Scituate's at a point now where the ocean wants to overwash that barrier beach almost during every storm. And you can see it on the news. I mean, there's rocks that get thrown over the seawall.
Yeah, it's wild.
And all that sort of thing. But it's not going to be easy for them as time goes on.
Yeah, I bet. All right. Well, I just realized we went 25 minutes straight here, I think. So let's take our first music break. I got caught up in this. It's too interesting. But we'll be right back. This is Mike Morris, chairman of Storm Surge Group out of Newburyport here, doing a lot of great work. And as you've heard, some already very interesting discussions here from Plum Island to Scituate to really across the world. So we'll be right back here on Joppa Radio 96.3. Again, Mike Morris, chairman of Storm Surge, joining us. He will be back in a moment. This is Afternoon Drive on Joppa Radio. All right, and welcome back to Afternoon Drive here on Joppa Radio. My name is Drew Moholland. Great guest in-house here today. Again, hello to everybody on the television. I'll get it back on me here on the TV. Hello. See, there I am. Joined by Mike Morris. He's been a great conversation here so far, chairman of the group Storm Surge. We've covered a lot of interesting ground, and we were just talking off the air a little bit, and, I was actually looking up how much this was a record-breaking, like $200 billion it cost, all the damage from the hurricanes. And we were just talking dollars a little bit, and Mike was telling me a little bit about storms that you don't even really know have happened. It's not one of the big ones that's on your news every night, but you were just telling me about a 2015 storm and one that had real global impact. And then you talked a little bit about bottom line. So why don't you tell me what you were just saying off the air, because it's very interesting.
Yeah, so, if you're watching your meteorologist on the news at 6 o'clock, typically you're going to hear about weather that is going to be affecting you tomorrow. So they're looking to the west. And once that weather exits off past Cape Cod, you don't hear too much about it.
Give me the 5-day forecast, right?
Exactly. But me being a surfer and looking out over the ocean to see what kind of swell is going to come in from maybe a distant storm, and also being interested in meteorology myself, I look at stuff that happens in other parts of the world. So one interesting little tidbit we were talking about during the break was a storm that formed out near Colorado, pulled some Gulf moisture with it, and turned into a pretty good-sized storm in the central part of the country that caused a lot of flooding in the Mississippi River Valley right around Christmas time, and actually made quite a few people homeless, flooded a bunch of houses in various communities. The storm then exited off of the East Coast, gave us a bit of snow, but once it got out over the Atlantic near Greenland, the thing started tapping into the Gulf Stream and really exploded, created a huge amount of damage in Iceland, and then also a lot of flooding and damage in the British Isles. And I think it was a global disaster worth $9 million, just this one, $9 billion, just for this one storm.
One storm, man.
And what we were also talking about was, okay, so how does that get paid for? So, most people don't connect the dots that this globally cost the economy that much money. But insurance companies are looking at those numbers because they're insuring all of these properties worldwide. And when you start having these big natural disasters and you start having lost leaders on insurance policies, these costs need to be made up somewhere else. So you're going to see costs for disasters shifted into your car insurance policy, shifted into your health insurance policy, your homeowner's policy, and so on down the line, because somehow we as a society need to pay for this. And the insurance companies are the people that really believe in climate change because they're seeing it on the bottom line. And, in the capitalist world, money is the scorecard. And if you're seeing negative numbers, it tells you that something's not right, and they're seeing it in their bottom line.
It's so interesting. And yeah, so coming out of your pocket, essentially, if down the road at least, it might not be immediately. But
Sure.
I wonder, I'm going to kind of take a wild shift of gears here, just because I was thinking about, and I'm not 100% sure if this is your area of expertise, but I have a feeling you know more than I do about it. Bill Belichick and the Patriots just went down to Mexico City to play a football game. They, trained out at the Air Force Academy there, and they just stayed out there and then went down to Mexico City. All that talk about altitude and how difficult it is to adjust. Have you had these experiences with the altitude? I mean, it seems like a really real thing. The Patriots struggled in Denver all those years. It seemed like they would get tired in the second half, or a very strange phenomenon. The altitude.
Yeah,
phenomenon is probably the wrong word, but
I've had that happen to me. I have family in Germany, and back in 2012, we took a family trip to Germany and Austria, and we were up in the Alps. And I remember swimming in an outdoor Olympic-sized pool there, and just feeling so poor, out of shape.
Yeah.
And then we did a bunch of hiking up, well above the tree line, and so on and so forth. But when I came back to sea level here in Newburyport, I could run 5 miles no problem, and swimming was great. But that quickly went away about a week later because my body started to get acclimated to sea level again. And when you train at elevation, your body more efficiently uses oxygen, and that's where the endurance comes in.
It's crazy. And then, of course, the ball travel, too. You had the Gostkowski there, the kicker. It made that kick that looked like it would have been good from 80 yards. Just that thing was traveling like crazy.
Yeah, there's not as much air up there.
And I guess the deal with that, they were saying, and I just found this part to be interesting, again, just because they had the game there a couple of weeks ago, but the Patriots decided to stay there because you can either, I guess, stay there for a long time and really get acclimated to it, or you want to just kind of get in and get out and not let your body get used to it, which is, I think, what the Raiders did down there. They tried to get in that day, play the game, and get out, and hopefully they wouldn't be affected. Two different kind of strategies, I guess, of dealing with it.
Yeah, I would think you'd probably want to stay there as long as. Actually, you should probably just train at altitude and then play games at sea level.
Yes,
That'd be
there
really
you go.
good.
Yeah, judging by how that game went, maybe a big win for the Patriots. But so the altitude thing, I was just curious about that. Every time I watch those games in Denver and Mexico City in this case, I'm always thinking about that. But so let's talk a little bit more about your programs here. Tell me about some of these past ones. You got one coming up you talked about on December 7th. Is this has this been a pretty popular thing? You finding a lot of interest in the community of people coming out?
Yeah, I mean, there's certain people that attend. We've channeled about 3,000 attendees through our programs since we started back in 2013.
That's a lot in a short time.
Yeah, and being a volunteer group, everybody's doing their part, and we've gotten a little bit of seed money from the Institution for Savings, been very generous, and also the New England Grassroots Fund. But that money's been mostly used for promotion and bringing speakers in. We've had university level people come in and talk on various topics, from erosion control methods to climate change in New England specifically, what that means 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. We've had a professor from MIT come in, talk about hurricanes, and generally had a good response. I mean, the speakers are eager to come in and talk about this sort of thing, and our programs usually attended by between 50 up to maybe 150 people on some of the more popular ones that we.
And I was looking at some of the names of your speakers. These aren't this isn't the kind of thing where they're going to just kind of speaking to hear themselves speak. These are really good speakers and really interesting stuff.
Yeah, I mean, Kerry Emanuel from MIT. I mean, he's a big guy. Another guy, Rob Young, a famous coastal geologist. We had him here back in the spring. I mean, he's been in New York Magazine. He's been on CNN. I mean, these aren't welterweights.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, what is the current project for you guys, or what interests you right now the most?
Well, right now we've got Newburyport's ear, and they're active in identifying their risks to storms and sea level rise, and they're working to come up with a plan and how to fund this plan and do things to make the community more resilient.
It has to be one of the bigger kind of breeding grounds for these kind of projects, Newburyport, because you think about like I said, I mean, when these storms happen on the news, they come here, they come to Situate, the Cape, and I mean, those are the hot spots, right?
Sure. I mean, that's what you hear about for sure. But a big storm like the one we're going to be talking about on the 7th, and the city is going to talk about how they're going to respond to this. Big storms like that, that's a region-wide disaster. So it's not Newburyport, Situate that are going to be harmed. You're talking, electrical outages across eastern Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, and down into Rhode Island and Connecticut, and major disruption,
We just kind of had some major disruption there a couple of months ago with all the power outages throughout New England.
Yeah, I mean, and you really consider the vulnerabilities. I mean, I live in West Newbury right now, and just on my street alone, I was walking the dog the other day, and I'm looking at the power wires laced between all of these trees, just on my street alone. And I'm like, one tree comes down, and the whole street's out. And just with that 50, 60 mile an hour wind that we had for 2 hours that one night back in October, that created power outages in our town in certain spots that lasted for 4 days. And at my business, I didn't have internet for 4 days. Not because there was anything going on in Newbury, but the node where Comcast signal comes from had to be shut down so that they could repair power lines and stuff in and around that area wherever that was located.
And teenagers everywhere did not know how to live.
Well, business these days, if you don't have internet, I mean, I had no access to technical information, couldn't order parts and things like that. The power may as well have been shut off because it couldn't do anything.
Yeah, and actually, while you just mentioned the parts in your job, you got to tell me a little bit more about this. So if I need work in my car, I can come to you. Is that the deal now?
As long as it's a BMW or a Mini.
Well, I'm out of that category then. Those are different. If I remember correctly, and I've never actually owned one myself, a BMW, but you have to go to a BMW dealer to get those things fixed, right? Or somebody who specializes in these things because...
Yeah, at least a specialist. These days all the manufacturers have proprietary information, and the tooling and the software that you need to work on these cars is kind of crazy. You just can't afford to work on every make and model out there because it's just too complicated. So you find people specializing maybe within 2 or 3 different brands, but after that it starts to get fairly expensive to keep up with, especially the software.
And I think I caught you saying you're a surfer too. Did I hear that right?
Yep.
So you're kind of turning into the most interesting man in the world here as we talk to you a little bit. How'd you take up surfing? Where did that habit pick up?
I started back in Seabrook Beach. I used to go there as a kid. With
a surfing mecca, or?
Yeah, it wasn't a surfing mecca, but my family used to go there. We used to live in Haverhill back at that time, back in the late '60s, and I remember watching the surfboard kind of washing around in the waves that this boy and girl brought down to the beach, and I kept fantasizing how I was going to take that thing home. And as we were leaving the beach, we saw it standing at the gas station with a for sale sign on it, and so that got purchased, and that's where it all started for me.
Interesting. I got a couple good friends actually who have moved and have stayed in San Diego here for the last 5 to 10 years, and it's funny, the thing about San Diego with that 72 degrees every day, it seems to kind of keep people there. I'm noticing, but it seems like they all took up surfing too, and I mean, for me, I've never been on a surfboard in my entire life, but and I don't think these guys had either. They're just a couple Danvers guys, but it's funny how they've grown to love surfing.
Yeah, I mean, I've surfed in San Diego before, and that's a pretty cool spot. I actually had dolphins swimming around in the surf zone.
Yeah, I guess that happens fairly regularly.
A lot, yeah. And I mean, there we were late October. Here in New England, we're already wearing full wetsuits, and out there I'm surfing with my son. The water was like 70, 75 degrees. It was an 85-degree day, and I had dolphins swimming around. It couldn't have been any more perfect. But I mean, California, Southern California, it's a year-round thing, and people will take it up because it's there.
You get the dolphins swimming around you in San Diego. The shark thing has kind of become more of a problem in Massachusetts. That is not, at least it didn't feel like that was an issue when I was growing up as much. Does this have any connection to the warming of the ocean that you talked about earlier, or is it kind of two different animals, so to speak?
It's related a little bit. I mean, I'm familiar with that whole thing too.
I kind of guessed that.
Yeah, back in the old days when I was a teenager, I was a crew for my dad on his private charter boat, and we used to go tuna fishing quite a bit. And back in those days, there was more in the way of tuna around than there is today. Now, these big sharks, they feed off of big animals. They eat tuna, they eat large striped bass, they eat marine mammals like porpoises and dolphins, and they also feed on seals. So if you fish out the offshore food supply like the tuna, as we have, what's left over? Well, all of a sudden, this burgeoning population of seals that we have residing along the coast. So the buffet has moved from offshore to inshore. And so now the sharks are working to control the seal population, because that's how nature works. It uses predators to balance off overgrowths of animals further down the food chain.
That is interesting, and I mean every summer now, even kind of off summer.
Well, I've had personal experiences up here.
Oh, tell me about that now.
Sure, yeah. A couple of years ago on Plum Island, did an early morning paddle on my paddleboard, and perfect shark weather, as far as that goes, because it was a little bit overcast, the water was really dark, low light.
That's perfect shark weather?
Well, when you understand that a great white shark is an ambush predator, it swims along the bottom, and all it's doing is looking at the surface, and it's looking for a silhouette that matches what its typical food source is. So if it's looking for seals, it's looking for a silhouette that's sort of torpedo-shaped, maybe up to 8 feet long.
Uh-oh.
And in the murky waters we have here in low light conditions, they just kind of see the shape, and so they'll investigate that. And ask questions later.
Investigate.
So I got a pretty hard bump on the bottom of my paddleboard that almost knocked me off the board. And a couple of
must have been horrifying.
Oh yeah, heart was beating, and there was nobody else around. I was a couple hundred yards off the beach, and wondering what the heck should I do. But the shark hit the board, realized it wasn't a seal, and kept on going. I had a couple of scrape marks across the bottom of the board and an impression from where his snout hit.
It's quite a collector's item, huh?
Yeah. 2 days later, we found a mauled seal wash up on the beach. Yeah, so it's definitely...
It found its meal, yeah. And what time was that during the day?
It was in August.
Was it not what time of day?
I was on the water, 6, 7 in the morning.
So that's going to be kind of a lonely feeling, you and a shark out there at 6 in the morning during sunrise, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
I can imagine. My goodness, wow. So that's a scary one. Any other scary one? Because you do put yourself. I mean, I always say this. Even people that go out and report on these storms, these reporters, and anybody goes out and does this line of work, even if it's a calm day, you might run into. You never know what nature's going to bring. I'm sure you've run into some moments where maybe you got caught off guard a little bit just by what nature brought. Some interesting.
Just even surfing. A couple, not last summer, the summer before, Labor Day weekend, we had pretty good sized swell from a hurricane that was just off of Cape Cod, and my son and I went surfing up off of Boar's Head in Hampton. And I'm getting older now. I'm pushing 60, and he's 18, so there's a whole lot more energy in his arms than mine. And within a matter of minutes, wave heights went from about head high to like double overhead. Oh. And we found ourselves paddling for open ocean.
Double overhead, so twice your body. Okay. Yeah. Wow.
And paddling for open ocean, trying to get over this set of waves that was coming in. And there were a bunch of guys in back of us, and these waves broke.
Literally trying to get around the...
Well, you're just trying to get over them.
Okay.
Before they crest.
Okay.
Once that white water starts tumbling, that's just a wall of water that's rushing towards you. And
so it's like a panic, almost kind of a panic swim, right?
You know it's coming. If you've done enough surfing in big waves, you know you're going to get surfers call it being ragdolled. It's like a dog taking a ragdoll and just shaking it.
Yeah.
And you got to hold your breath for a while. And it's usually not just one wave, it's probably 5, that you're going to make it through.
My goodness.
So anyway, young boy made it. Old man didn't.
Well, you made it. But
yeah,
could have been worse.
I got the thrashing. I almost got beat up into the rocks. Got washed all the way into the lifeguards over there, and they're standing on the beach. And they said, "Do you see anybody floating around out there?" And I'm like, "No, I'm not. From what I could see." And it says, "Because this board washed up."
Yeah.
Where the leash had broken, but they hadn't found who it belonged to.
Gotcha.
And so they were wondering if there was somebody out there that needed to be saved, but. Yeah, that was one of those times that made me think a little bit.
I bet it did. When you to take up the surfing, and I mean that always seems like, I mean, even I just watched some of the videos on YouTube. I mean, some of these people take on incredible waves, and they're getting under the waves and they're cresting over you, and it's amazingly beautiful to watch.
Sure.
But also looks scary as can be.
It's I mean, that's part. I guess I have this like sort of daredevil streak in me, right? So I surf, I race cars, so there's a certain element of danger that I kind of enjoy. I guess it makes you feel alive, but
and you try to save the coastlines.
Yeah, I mean that's
in your spare time.
That's me trying to fix things, right? I'm a fixer, so I see what the problem is. I said this is what you need to do, and sometimes people follow my instructions, sometimes they don't.
How often do you still surf?
Actually, just went over Thanksgiving with my son.
Where at?
Up at Hampton Beach.
So a holiday at Hampton Beach doing some surfing?
Yeah.
Is that a popular, do you find many people out there on Thanksgiving surfing?
Yeah, I mean, surfing's gotten real popular in the last 10 years. The wetsuit technology is,
The what now?
Wetsuit.
Oh, wetsuit. Okay, wetsuit. Yeah,
is really superior now.
So you can do it at all times of year.
Yeah, I mean, back when I was a kid, we had crappy diver suits. They leaked. They were thick and cumbersome. You were like Gumby out on a surfboard. And the stuff that they have now is very thin, holds a lot of heat, very flexible. I mean, you can go out in the middle of winter and not be cold.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that's very cool. Seems like a great hobby.
Yeah,
it's not for me. I'm not as daredevil a streak as you, but
you gotta be comfortable in the water.
Yeah, I prefer the swimming pool or the nice calm lake. But yeah, and another thing when we were talking about climate change, and this one it may not be connected at all. I don't know. And Maine has had tornadoes before, but we had a tornado rip through our campground this summer, 4th of July weekend,
Sure.
up at about a half hour up from Sebago. I had never seen that before up there. We had the occasional warning when I was younger. You get the alarm on your phone or whatever, but nothing ever comes.
Sure.
In fact, I was telling my sister to calm down. You're rowling up the aunts.
Yeah.
Bad call by me because a tornado ripped through and really destroyed several cabins. It destroyed a few cars. My poor cousin had her brand new car just completely smashed. Trees down, roads blocked, power out for days. Not good. I wonder if the tornadoes, I mean, it's not just these hurricanes, right? I mean, it's storms in general. I wonder, could tornadoes, I mean, we're going to start to see more of these in this neck of the woods?
Sure. I mean, one of the terms that's being used out there is not global warming, but global weirding, because weird things are happening now.
Yeah.
And
they did get away from the people that want to really get the awareness out. They kind of stopped using global warming even. Let's call it climate change because it's misleading, right?
Sure. Well, it's not so much misleading as it is, or what are we going to call this that, is not political. That's trying to call it something else,
right.
than what causes people to fight about it. But from my what I've learned from some of the PhDs that we've had in our programs, the ones that are very familiar with climatology and meteorology, have said basically what you're going to see is what's happening in the south, like along the Carolinas, is going to be happening to the north now as well.
Yeah.
So what we used to, term Tornado Alley, you kind of visualize that somewhere between Texas and the Midwest, right?
Yep.
And we used to have it such that tornadoes mostly happened in the spring and into the summer, and then it kind of just stops in the wintertime.
Yep.
Well, we kind of have them year-round now in Tornado Alley. They just never stop.
Yeah.
There's severe weather all the time. And now what we've seen in the last 10 years, we've seen tornadoes happening in New England, which is outside of the normal range for which that happens.
Right.
And the thinking is that as this climatology moves northward in response to the extra heat that's at the equator, some of these weather characteristics that you see further to the south are going to be happening further to the north. And they're also thinking that the hurricane track, which primarily ducks pretty much south of New England for the most part, is also going to lift further north, which is going to put us at a greater risk for hurricanes in the future.
And this is one of these things that you can predict. This will probably happen. This is happening. We're watching it happen, right? Yeah. Interesting. And one thing I always talk with I do a lot of work with Barry Burbank and Danielle Niles and these meteorologists over at WBZ, and it is very humorous for me to hear them get phone calls if they ever miss a forecast or are off, and you know, people are, even if it's just bad weather, a storm, they seem to get blamed for it. It's pretty funny actually to watch that, weather people getting yelled at. But one thing I always hear him say when he gets an angry caller, and they laugh it off, of course. But one thing I always hear them say is weather inexact science. We do the best we can, but we're never going to be precise. We'll get close, but it's never going to be 100% accurate. Right. And I'm sure you've heard that before.
Well, there's so many variables that go into a forecast, you know, and really now, I mean, it was probably even more difficult 20 years ago, but now you've got supercomputers. I mean, the Euro model, you know, almost takes a day to run, you know. It only updates twice a day because it takes so long for it to process all the information that feeds into it. Yeah. And despite all the information and data that thing boils down, still, you know, we're only really accurate a couple days out. You know, we have an inkling of what's going to happen further out, and you know, forecasting hurricanes is even more of an art or a challenge, I should say, because they're so susceptible to what the upper level winds are doing and the steering currents. It's really hard to predict. And then the other thing that the models don't have a really good handle on is how fast the hurricanes have been able to intensify. Because it hasn't happened before, so there isn't any data on that. Yeah. For them to work off of, and so these storms that go from a Category 1 to a Category 5 in less than 24 hours, it's just never happened before. And you think about some of these, you know, poor communities that do get caught off guard, maybe don't have time to evacuate. We've seen some real problems with that just in recent months. Yeah, evacuation is a tough thing, right? Because as a community, when you order an evacuation, you don't want to be the one that cries wolf, you know, because you're disrupting a lot of people and creating a lot of panic and confusion and cost and so on and so forth. Throw in some political pressure and then if the storm doesn't come, then they call Barry Burbank. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that is indeed what they do. So why don't you, final couple minutes here, I'll let you take the floor. Why don't you tell people to come on out, get involved. Again, this is Mike Morris, chairman of Storm Surge. I got caught up in this conversation a little bit. I should have said your name a lot more as we went. But Mike Morris, chairman of the group Storm Surge, doing a lot of great work in Newburyport, Plum Island specifically. He's been all over there, but doing a lot of great work in Newburyport and holding community gatherings. Why don't you tell people how they can get involved with you and hear more great stories like this? Sure. So we've got our event on December 7th at City Hall, and we're going to have the mayor and a number of people from various city departments, emergency management, Department of Public Works and engineering, as well as the Conservation Commission and the sustainability coordinator. And what we're going to do is present a mock storm scenario that we developed with the National Weather Service in Taunton. So it's a realistic type of storm that could very well happen 14 days from now, because that's beyond the 10-day forecast. Yep. And we have certain vulnerabilities. So you might want to come and hear what the city is doing to address those vulnerabilities, and then also start thinking about how would you react if you didn't have power at your house for a week in March when it's cold out. You had to do 4 days. I'm sure you got some hints. Yeah. So, you know, there's things that you need to do as a homeowner or a resident to help yourself as well. In terms of getting involved, there's a website. Gosh, I should remember the URL. Stormsurge.org, I think. Storm-surge, I think, .org. Storm Surge, Mike Morris. If you Google Storm Surge Newburyport, it should come up. Anyway, there's a means to get in contact with us there. There's also some information on the site about us, what we've done in the past. Some of our presentations are available on video, past presentations that you can watch because we have a YouTube channel as well. But we're looking for all kinds of people. You don't have to be a scientist to help us out. If you're a marketing guy, if you can write, if you don't mind doing press releases, if you just don't, you know, if you like just kind of helping out and organizing things, we need all kinds of people like that. You getting some kids involved? I wonder, it doesn't, I'm assuming it's more of an adult thing, but it would be great to get kids, right? But we do want to get kids involved. Yeah. We have some kids from Newburyport High School that are helping out with some of our programs. We also need people to videotape. Work with the local cable station. I just saw some ears go up here on the right. Inside our studios. So somebody who's interested in film and editing and that sort of thing, we got work for you. There you go. All right. Well, Mike Morris, chairman of the group Storm Surge here in Newburyport. It has been a pleasure, sir.
Really, really enjoyed it. Some great stories. What did we cover? We covered global warming. I don't think we fixed it, but we covered it. We got Plum Island. We got surfing, sharks.
Yep.
All good. Many more topics, too. It was great. Very interesting stuff all around. And thank you so much for coming in. And
Thanks for having me.
Really, let's do it again someday. What do you say?
Will do.
All right, that's Mike Morris, and just like that, once again, the show keeps flying. 1 hour in the books. We're in and out. That one went by very quickly, but I hope you enjoyed that, folks. Again, that's going to be the structure of the show here. It's going to be not really any one defined topic coming in. We'll do some sports if we want to do sports. We'll do some news if we want to do news. We'll talk about climate change and the erosion. We'll talk about that on a day like this. Really anything. Our goal is to get these interesting guests. There's so many interesting people in this community. So that is the goal here on 96.3 Joppa Radio every Tuesday and Thursday at 3 o'clock for 1 hour, which I am quickly learning is the quickest hour in radio for me here. So thank you so much. We'll see you back here next week on Tuesday. Again, big thanks to Mike Morris, chairman of Storm Surge. Get over to one of those meetings. They're great.